problems here is that we obviously have to use words and concepts to get this across, and I think perhaps in your teaching, certain words have either become, in any teaching, frankly, certain words become either part of the jargon, part of the lexicon, or stigmatized as being misleading. And it's, whether a word like recognition or knowing or insight or wisdom or emptiness or consciousness, you may not like the sound of many of those words, but yet someone else might find them indispensable to try to indicate the same thing. And so on some level, there's just some semantic work to get through to figure out how to talk about this. But, I mean, for instance, I completely follow what you're saying. I'd have slightly different associations with some of these terms. So when you say something like, you can't recognize this thing.
It's not, but you can't.
But you can cease to overlook it. I mean, we're talking about something that when recognized, to use now a loaded term, part of that recognition is that this is always the case, right? It's not constructed by the act of recognition. It's not produced by it. This isn't a change in yourself that you have made because now you're paying attention in a new way. This is the way, here, I'm going to use another reckless term, this is the way consciousness is already.
Yeah.
You're not producing this, but it sounds like you're not a fan of those particular words. So perhaps you should just get rolling a little bit and describe how you describe this so that I can adopt your terminology.
Right. I don't actually think it's a pedantic issue. I think it's just so, the suggestion is so illogical, which is why I don't think anybody ever really chooses this, because it doesn't conform to the expectations or needs of the seeking energy. It's completely inconceivable that there is no separation, that there isn't something that happened that made this where this suggestion comes from real. It's the best I do is I can say things like it's an unhappening. So the experience of being an individual unhappens because it never really happens. There's never really separation. It's an illusory experience of separation. So that unhappens. Consciousness unhappens as far as somebody knowing what this is, in that it's recognized or revealed that consciousness is a contracted energy of knowing, of separation. I am conscious of, or I know something, or there's awareness going on. And the suggestion isn't that there's the expectation of the individual is that something needs to be added. And what we're suggesting is that that's an illusory experience, and that the end of that isn't an addition to things. And there isn't someone, so Jim doesn't walk around with the non-dual awareness or non-dual consciousness. There's just a seeming lack of solidity to the appearance. It just doesn't, there's a need of the individual to find something, a need to know that it is. And that seems to create an experience of solidity in the appearance. But when that stops happening, that isn't something new revealed. It's the end of something that wasn't happening already. Was that enough for you to get a little bit of the jargon?
Yeah. So I'm sure this is a high wire act that I'm going to fail at various points because, but I track all of that. Again, I have some words that I like to use that mean some of those same things, but let's see how we proceed. Because again, there are things you said even there which almost by your own logic you shouldn't be able to say if we're really going to strip words or push words to the breaking point here.
Yeah.
So it's something like contracted energy, like describing this pseudo position from which everyone seems to start, and the undoing of which, or the apparent undoing of which, is the resolution of this non-process. How do you describe this self-illusion? I mean, where are people apparently stuck? Because contracted energy is one interesting way of describing what this is like.
Well, it's revealed in how it falls apart, and this is just a story. It has no no helpful quality to it at all to know this. But when it falls apart, what's revealed is there's a contracted energy in the body, and the first thing that arises out of that is a sense of here. Here is then the first thing that seems to be known, and it feels very secure in a way, comforting. There's something real. And out of that here-ness comes an experiential center, an illusory experiential center of I am here. From that arises the entire story that this appearance is connected in a real way, and that's called my life. And part of that need that arises when I have a life is one of meaning and purpose and the need to know. And that is basically my life of trying to find a better experience through knowing or having experiences, or however you want to talk about it. And that whole description is an illusion. There never is a real separate entity that needs to know. Nor is there a real separate entity that can know in that way. Of course, Jim knows where his house is, but there's no need of knowing that center experience in relation to that information that arises of where the house is.
So then what is different in your experience in mundane moments like knowing where your house is? Right, so obviously you're capable of thinking, you're capable of having a conversation like this, so thought doesn't stop or need not stop.
It's obvious that nobody's having it, the thought, though.
Right.
For the individual, when whatever arises, it's like a cloud of knowing. There actually never is something inside the body, although that's the experience. There's a cloud of knowing that arises, which imbues everything that seems to appear inside and outside the body. And that's all me. That's all me in my world. It takes ownership. So it takes ownership of thoughts. It takes ownership of feelings. It takes ownership in the things that it belongs to it or doesn't. Everything is in its purview and belongs to it as an experience. And that just disappears like a cloud, like a fog lifting. And so a thought arises, but nobody has it.
How does this relate to suffering?
Depends on what you call suffering.
Yeah,
if we call it seeking.
Well, so you feel free to push in that direction. What is, obviously many people approach this topic as a project of reducing suffering, understanding something about the mechanics of suffering such that one no longer suffers in the same ways, and perhaps ultimately doesn't suffer at all, depending on what one means by suffering there. You initially said that it's impossible to want this thing because it doesn't answer to any of the spiritual needs people think they have, but doesn't no longer being taken in by the self-illusion answer to this problem or apparent problem of suffering?
It depends what you call suffering. I mean, in one way you can say that if you call suffering seeking or the need, then yeah, that would be the end of that. But of course, the conundrum then is, if the individual is seeking the end of the need, seeking that is just another need. This message truly isn't for anyone, because it really doesn't mirror any of the needs of the individual as far as needing to know more. The suggestion is that this conversation is unknowing or emptiness appearing as a conversation. And that's the beginning and the end of the whole thing. And that satisfies none of the questions, none of the needs of the individual.
Well, although there's potentially a lot riding on that moment when you cease to suffer the search, right? The search can be quite painful.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
And there's a tremendous relief in no longer being taken in by its logic.
Yeah.
So there's a freedom here, obviously. I mean, there's a freedom from the illusion of self, and that has consequences. What are its consequences?
I find it a little tricky to talk about it, because what we're talking about isn't something that anybody really gets. So I, if I can use that word, don't know about anything I'm about to tell you because it's not an experience. But there seems to be, like, the individual is constantly wanting to know. It's trying to control its circumstances. It feels very threatened by what's happening. It's trying to control its circumstances through knowing, through controlling, through making its choices, its imaginary choices of what it thinks it's going to bring about what it feels it's missing. And so that need to know filters through the memories quite a lot, has a lot of interactions with emotions as far as what's okay to feel, what's not okay to feel. It can make itself quite neurotic. And so in that way, that whole system, the mental and emotional system, can relax, become calmer, because there's nobody, quite literally, nobody left that's engaged in trying to find anything else, trying to find a better experience. There's simply what's arising. And so there's no longer the need to pick up every appearance and orient itself to it, as far as trying to find a path from here which is dissatisfying, fundamentally dissatisfying, to another experience which will be better. So in that way, you could say that emotional and mental suffering, which I think for the individual are the biggest things, does soften up. But it would be misleading to say that there's not uncomfortable thoughts or uncomfortable feelings that arise. There's just no longer anyone left engaging them. They just arise, and they just go away again. But I couldn't say that the end of suffering. There was an experience I had a long time ago where it was realized that you could starve to death, and that wouldn't be a problem. And there was no emotions that would touch me as a form of detachment. And I find that gets mixed up with what I'm talking about now. That's not what this message is now. That's a form of detachment, which I think a lot of teachings are aiming towards as far as a state of detachment. This message is truly that there's no center experience to the appearance. There's just what's appearing, and thereby there's no need coming from a personal position for it to become something else.
Just so I understand the contrast you just made, are you saying that there are traditional teachings that give a kind of false goal of detachment, like complete imperviousness to ordinary suffering, which you're...
Totally.
Okay.
Well, there are states which I happen to have realized or experienced. It's actually not an experience, but where that's... And I think pretty much that's what the first teacher I was involved with was teaching. And I do think, although I think it answers totally the quest of the individual, that would be what it wants most, to be able to be in that detached state and be unaffected by the thoughts and feelings, which seems to be its biggest issue. That's not what this message is.
So what then is the status of an emotion like anger or sadness in this condition? Post self-illusion, is there any logic by which an emotion like anger would arise?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, any emotion can arise, it seems. It's just when there's an individual, it arises within a context of good and bad and right and wrong, and the path that I seem to be on called my life of trying to find a better experience, or they're just being the emotion. That's the difference.
But to not be taken in by the illusion of separateness, right? And to not
But there isn't anybody that's not taken in.
Right, but there's, conventionally speaking, there's still the person, Jim, in the world who is now...
But there isn't really. We're not talking about a separate experience of spirituality in one reality, and then Jim just moves back into this other reality. We're quite literally talking about that this, let's say this conversation, or whatever seems to be arising, is the whole of everything. There isn't anything outside of it. There's only this instantaneous isness, which can't even be objectified, so you can't actually say it is. You'd have to say it is and isn't. And that doesn't have a real continuum in which it functions or acts. Now, we can talk about the function of the brain and what that does, but then we're getting into a story, trying to explain something, and you really can't explain this instantaneousness that's just appearing now for absolutely no reason.
Yeah, so I think I frame this a little differently. I think I'm acknowledging the same set of facts, but I think there's some facts left out, or some, apparent facts left out by one of these frames. I think we can talk about this at the level of experience, where I would use terms like consciousness and its contents and the mind, right? And then there's certainly reason to believe that the experiential component of this conversation doesn't subsume all of reality, whatever that is altogether, right? Like you and I could both suffer heart attacks in the middle of this conversation, and the city of Paris would be unaffected. At the very least, that sentence will make sense to virtually everyone, right?
Yes, and this message doesn't.
Well, no, but I think it can. Perhaps I'm more hopeful than you that we can really bring it right up to the...
But it seems like you're actually trying to talk to somebody about it, and I keep trying to reference the fact that there isn't anybody to tell. When there isn't anybody left in the body, it's recognized that there isn't anyone anywhere.
Yeah.
There isn't anyone to help. The only time that there's someone else is when a body goes, there's somebody here.
Yeah, help.
Otherwise,
help.
There isn't.
Yeah, no, I get that. So, here are two places where I would differentiate these two frames of reference: the kind of the experience side, the knowing side, the epistemology side, and the reality at large side. Talking about the cosmos, say, or what is here when neither one of us are aware of anything anymore. So, obviously there are many things we understand about the world, or seem to understand about the world. We can make predictions about the future. We can manipulate the material world, whatever its relationship is ultimately to the mind, and produce certain effects that are obviously amazing, right? We've got a virus burning through 200 countries right now, and we're busily producing vaccines to stop that problem. And that there's a level at which knowledge claims and causality and all of that is working more or less as described, and the difference between knowledge and ignorance there really has obvious consequences within that purview. There's a difference between having a vaccine for coronavirus that works and and one that doesn't work, but you thought would work. So those are different states of the world, and they will matter to many people who think they are individuals, living life projects that, wherein death is really a problem. So there's that level of the conversation where we can talk about things like vaccines and viruses and, ordinary objects. But then there's the experiential side, which we're focusing on now, where we're drilling down on just what is the nature of consciousness, what's the nature of being in the world in this moment, and what can we really say about that, and what is available to experience or to cease experiencing that is of interest here. And there you can notice things like, though yes, we can talk about viruses and mRNA as a mechanism by which you'd produce some novel vaccine, right? But the truth is, when you really pay attention, you realize you don't know what anything is.
Yeah.
You can't know anything. You look at your own hand, you don't even know what a hand is, right? It's like there is just this bright circumstance that is intrinsically mysterious, right? So I think we can do justice to both sides of that without falsifying either.
Yeah, absolutely. And but I'll have to say this everything you've described, the way you describe it, it sounds like there's two different realities. The one of the world, where all these aspects or contingencies are apparently happening, and then the what you mentioned as the experiential, focusing down, drilling down on now, and the unknowingness of that. And what what the message is about is that both of those things are simply what is. And that what is emptiness appearing. And what seems to happen when there's no longer an individual interested or with that intrinsic need for the appearance to be one way or another, yeah, you can totally talk about there being a wonderful thing that a vaccine is the RNA and the new vaccine that's coming out, and that people won't die, and that can be seen as a positive thing. And at the same time, that entire thought is emptiness appearing. It really, in essence, has no value and is not separate from what is. The dream of the individual is that there's what's happening to me, and that necessarily creates or has within it the need for something else, because what is, as known, is dissatisfying. And so it lives in these two realities. And when that experience falls away, and we're actually talking about the end of experience, then there is obviously only what is. And that is then, I can't say seen, but it's no longer experienced as real. It's never experienced as unreal. But there's no longer this extra added on experience of real and therefore mattering and therefore having value. And what's left without that, and these things aren't true, they're only true in reflection of the end of that experience, is that what is then recognized or seen or revealed to be unconditional love and unrecognizable freedom. So it's not sort of some denatured zombie experience, but it's the recognition that this doesn't actually need anything already.
Are there fluctuations in your awareness of this, or would you say that this is a stable?
I'm not aware of it. This isn't an awareness.
Well, again, I realize I'm walking through the minefield of...
It's not a minefield. It's that you're actually coming... I don't know that you quite understand what I'm saying. The radical nature of the message, that I'm truly saying that what is arising is unknowing. And that only seems to change in the illusory experience of the individual, where there is unknowing, which is appearing, and then another imaginary reality called something else. Because everything you've described so far is still what is.
Yeah, no,
it never moves.
Yeah, no, I get that. And so, but again, there are terms that are apparently sanctioned in your vocabulary, and there are terms that hit a tripwire, right? So knowing detonates, but something like emptiness, I can get across the minefield with emptiness in head, right? So
I don't think that's fair.
Well, I'm comfortable with both terms. I just don't necessarily know. I'm not familiar enough with your teaching to know when I'm going to step on a landmine. So I just have to step on them.